Today, I'm going to be showing you guys how I recreated See-Through by the band Camino. We're going to show you how to layer up pop guitars with a bit of a heavier edge to it, how to use some sample enhancement to get your drums to pop, and how to beef up your mid-range with some synthesizers. But before we jump into all that, let me introduce myself. Hi, my name is Seth. I produce music under the name Velvet Year. I do one of these videos every Friday to show people how to produce their own music at home. Songs I've either written or produced have been featured on these Spotify curated playlists, and I did an entire album through Warner Music. So if you enjoyed this video and you think we'd have fun working on a project together, check out the top link in my description. On to the rest of the video. So I think we will start out with our guitar layers, which sound like this. Also, shout out to the guys at Modern Metal Songwriter. I'm friends with the guys who run it online, and they gave me early access to their plugin. They didn't sponsor this video or anything, but I use their Clairvoyant plugin on every guitar layer. So if you're into stuff like this, I'll link their plugin below. But one of the first things I want to talk about with this guitar performance is just how tightly I edited them all. So just for an example, I left an unedited one here, which sounds like this. And so one of the first things I did to get that really clean, modern pop rock sound was I went through and cut all of those points in between the chord hits and added a crossfade. In my experience, this tends to be a bit more effective than using something like a noise gate. And then once I edit all of them, I will highlight the region and just consolidate it into be one clip. And now we have this very simple loop that sounds super clean. Also with guitar-based pop stuff, you want to make sure you're not cutting off the scrape leading into the next hit. So normally here for the downbeat of the first hit, I actually prefer people to consolidate it a bit before, just so you don't cut off the pick scrape that's normally happening here just before the hit. With this track, I was editing them, so it was a little bit more on the grid. But if you feel like your guitars sound too fake, it's normally because you're chopping off this early part. But like I said, I did that for all of these parts. So the first two that we're going to look at are these power chords here. If there's one thing I would say is crucial about getting the see-through sound, it's that you need low, chunky power chords underneath your main chordal layers. A power chord on a guitar is a root and a fifth. There's a lot of power harmonically with a perfect fifth. It can add a lot of clarity to a chord progression, even when you're playing it lower. And so it can be a really effective way to sort of beef up chord progression. But then on top of that, we have these two guys here, where I'm just playing chords in those D shapes that I showed you on my guitar pop video. Basically, you're playing your regular D chord shape, but you're moving your middle and pointer finger around to get more suspended voicings. And so blending these two together is where a majority of the kick of the song comes from. I have these chordal layers blended in a bit more just because there was a lot of other elements in the song that were more harmonically complex. So I figured it was easier to bring those guys down and let the power chords take more of the center stage. And then on top of all of it, we have this very tiny lead, which is just extending the chords that these guys are playing, but into that upper range, almost making it feel like a piano voicing, if that makes sense. Like here, if I play it without it, and if I play it with it, it just keeps it from sounding like it's just power chords. But if you're not really listening for it, you could miss it because it's very subtle and you're only playing a couple notes higher up on the neck. In terms of their actual tones, like I said, I'm using the Clairvoyance plugin for all of it. One thing that I do like about this plugin is this tilt knob, which is kind of similar to the bass shift knob that I showed you in that EQ I like a few videos ago. Basically, if you turn it one way, it will boost the low end and cut the high end. And then if you tilt it the other way, it will boost the high end and cut the low end, which can be really helpful when you're trying to differentiate two different parts that are using the same patch. For the main tone, I was just using their standard overdrive, and then I just kind of left the default IRs, which is another great way to sort of differentiate your guitar parts. If you're using the same patch, different cab sims are going to change the way that the tone is voiced a lot. But so yeah, we have that on these guys, going into a little bit of MoTT to layer it out, bringing down some of those lows. In terms of EQ with these guys, we want enough boom boominess to where we can get that chunk, but we don't want it to be overwhelming the mid-range because it's a very mid-range heavy song already. So we're high passing it, doing a bit of a cut around, looks like 160. And then on these guys specifically, I felt like the 4K was kind of excessive. That tends to be a problem with these like heavier tones, is there's a lot of like really nasty 4K stuff. And then going into some L1 just to even it out. Also, as you could hear, we have this guy underneath, which is me just playing some harmonics on, I think it was the 7th fret, using their lower channel, which isn't as gain heavy, but really driving it up a ton. And it just sort of adds this fun little counterpoint ear candy thing that happens when those big, giant, chuggy chords aren't. Like when you just listen to it here. It just feels like this big wall of sound hitting, followed by this very sparse, soft, whispery thing. It's almost like a vocal arrangement where you have a bunch of people in a choir singing in their chest voice, and then once they stop, you transition to a single person just sort of humming something in their falsetto, so you get that sort of contrast happening. Also, we did some pan automation, so it like sweeps from the sides. So it has this sweeping motion across the mix, which is another way it sort of contrasts that sort of big chunky layer in the middle. Now, when we get to the second part of the drop, it sounds like this. So with these guys here, we have the same tone, but they're just playing low notes. Really aggressive. We then have some strummy strat stuff. Used a little bit of Juno chorus on that one. I think I changed the IR a little bit too. You can have two IRs loaded up and sort of blend between them. So I probably could have just done this, but I think I was experimenting with different IRs on one side. We also have this guy. Just a very high droney lead that I pushed the gain up a bit because I really wanted that sort of almost a pad level of droning, but on the guitar layer, because I felt like they were really aggressive and having it be in that world just kind of fit better. And then as you could hear on the bus, we are sidechaining these guys when we get to this part of the drop. So if you see here for sidechain, it's just automating up when we get to that second half of the chorus. I felt like this was a very pop thing to do, to sort of treat the guitar layers as if they're just like a synthesizer and not be too precious about them getting out of the way of the drums or the vocals. But then, yeah, you can see we did some more tone shaping here, a little bit of harsh 6K, some high passing on the bus as a whole, and then bringing down a low pass down to like 4K, because after listening to some of the band Camino stuff, they tend to have pretty dark guitar mixes compared to what most people imagine their mixes are like. After that, we have our bass. With this one, I was really wanting to match the aggressiveness of those guitars. So we're using parallax. I found this, it's 99 again, which I thought was like a good mixture of distorted, but also that boomy low end. It's basically just playing the same riff as the guitars for the song, doing some high passing and some bass shift. I'm really trying to force myself to use more of the modules in Slate Virtual Mix Rack. Normally I just use their channel strips on the end of stuff. I've been having a lot more fun with like their dynamics modules. So I have the Monster here and the FG Bomber, which are just kind of destroying it. And then we're sidechaining it to the kick with some track spacer and a compressor. Pretty simple, honestly. For our synthesizers, we have this guy, which is our main keys layer, which is this analog emulation thing that I found in Ableton's stock library. Honestly, I'm going into more sound design stuff this year. That's like one of my goals, is to like push my sound design abilities. And so I've gone through a lot of my existing sounds that I didn't even know I had, like the stock Ableton library stuff. And a lot of it's pretty usable. I believe this is their wavetable synth, which has a lot of stuff going on. Running into some OTT pretty aggressively into some EQ. And this guy's really just meant to sort of boost that upper mid-range when the guitars are hitting and be this like synthetic wide layer that just makes it punch a little bit harder. We have another similar layer that comes in on the chorus, which is this Monastery Monks patch from Anna, just because I felt like in the second half of that chorus drop, there's something almost like a vocal pad happening, and I want something that was going to have that sort of movement. So bandpassed it a lot though, and just sort of blended it in under this one. And then one of my favorite layers of this song is this guy. this sort of like distorted, soft lead. I just found like a basic bell sound and then band passed it to really focus on these two ranges, this sort of 500 range and like, I think it's like 1.5K, 2K range, and then just dimed it into a saturator. Like here, if I turn all this stuff off with the EQs, with the saturator, and then it's just being dimed into some reverb sends. And it just sort of adds this fun little counterpoint of ear candy just as it's about to transition into the heaviest part, which is something fun. It's like, it's this really soft, gentle layer just before the drums go into a massive fill and the whole beat just like drops. It's like they almost raise it up to the softest point so that they can drop it down to the heaviest point. After that, we have our drums. For this guy, I'm using the Mixwave Thomas Pridgeon kit, and I'm layering up their snare with the Mixwave snare. And for that sample that I'm laying underneath it with the snare, I'm really boosting that sustain just because there was already a lot of natural reverb in the sample and I didn't feel like adding more reverb to it. Most of the time when you're trying to get this like heavy drum sound, the thing you're trying to get is just like a really nice tail on the snare drum. Like when you go to a live drum mixing session, at least the ones I've been to that are in this sort of heavier style, you're just kind of trying to cut the kick out of all of the room mics and isolate it so that when you compress the rooms like crazy, the main thing that's being brought up is that snare drum. A lot of times now on sends, I will, in the final mix, have just a snare reverb, which is just a verb that I will make specifically tailored to the snare, just to make it jump out a bit more. Like there are some studios where they will literally put like a couch in front of the kick drum so that they can block the kick drum from all of the room mics, because all they want is the snare. I have a kick trigger here, but it's not really going to the mix. I'm just using it as a trigger for that processing that we were using on the bass. And in terms of what they're playing, we've just got a very simple rock beat. And then when it goes to the B section of the chorus, it goes to more of like a dancier, like 4 on the floor vibe. Again, we're using that same shaker trick that I showed you guys before with like the Knox stuff, where if you want to add like a faster movement and higher energy, sometimes it's better to have your drums play something really slow and simple, and then have that sort of faster rhythm be taken up by a separate percussion element. So if we listen to this shaker, which is a shaker and a tambourine, I guess, it's doing 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, whereas the drums themselves are just doing 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. And so that can be really useful when you're trying to get that excitement or that speed. And then all these guys are running into some Kramer tape just to sort of add that EQ curve that tape saturation does, which I don't feel like I've talked about enough. Part of the reason why tape saturation sounds the way it does is when you add a saturator to something and you're using a tape saturator like this, it's not just adding like overtones or harmonics. It's doing a bit of an EQ curve, like a little bit of a mid scoop / a low boost. Also, if you drive it really heavy into the top here, it acts as a compressor. So depending on how you use a saturator, it can have one or multiple of a lot of different effects on your signal. And then here at the very end, we have clap impact, sidechain to the kick. And something that some people have asked is, what is this guy here on my master? Because this is on pretty much all of my masters by default. And before you ask, no, it does not actually apply anything. So this is Bounce in Place. This is a Max for Live plugin that I bought, which is really helpful for re-sampling stuff in Ableton. Let's say I wanted to make this tail really long. So what I could do is throw a bunch of reverb on it. And I've got some EQ baked on it, and I'm like, okay, this is the clap sample that I want to use for Forevermore. Bounce in Place is just going to automate a lot of those sort of tedious tasks of like resampling stuff in Ableton, because you have to like create an audio track and then set the output of this track as the input for that track, and then you have to like do all this stuff and hit record. And so what I do is I've gone into Ableton and I've added Bounce in Place on the master out as a default, and then you can map different functions of it to different parts of your keyboard. So I've mapped these 3 buttons, depending on what I need to use it for, to either the 7, 8, or 9 key. So I've soloed this track. So all I'm going to do now is just hit 9 on my keyboard. And boom, now all of that processing is baked into this sample. And if I wanted to, I could just delete this top one and I'm no longer using any of these plugins in my project. So Bounce in Place is really functional, especially if you are somebody who doesn't have the most CPU power, but also creatively, it makes things a lot easier because when you're doing stuff in audio, you can manipulate it a bit easier. Like you can do chops and stutters and things like that, which are kind of hard to automate when it's like unrendered. It's also great for like sound design purposes. Like there have been points where I've layered up multiple snare layers together and I've made a snare sample that I really liked that's like 3 parts. So I've literally just like highlighted that, soloed them all, and then hit that button. And then with Ableton, you can right click on anything and click Show in Explorer, and it will just show you where that exact audio file is in your computer. And so you can just drag and drop that to your sample library. Super useful, and I'm just in love with that. But yeah, after that, I'm using this utility plugin, just making the bass mono up to like 120, just because with heavier mixes like this where there's a lot of low end, it can be kind of flubby if you leave it in stereo. High passing it a little bit for the same reason. And then doing, again, a little bit of a cut on like that 4K range just because it was still really harsh. Tape saturator on the actual master. And you might be thinking, well, why are you using it twice? And it's because, like I said, they have different purposes in different scenarios. So when I was adding it to the drums here, I wanted some of those harmonics, but I also wanted a little bit of that compression. And so that's all I was using that for. But here on the master, I've actually turned down the record level a lot. So it's not compressing at all now. It's barely touching like 3 to 2 here. So adding some saturation, but we're not compressing anywhere near the same amount we are on the drums. And then on the IPS speed, which in the real world affects how fast these reels are running, affects the high end of the mix as a whole. So I wanted it to be a bit darker. And so this was a fast way to sort of darken things up. And then running into a little bit of L1. And that's everything. So let's listen to the final track. So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed that. If you have any other band Camino songs you would like me to look at, put them in the comments down below. Again, I do one of these videos every Friday, so if you would like to see more stuff like this, hit subscribe, the bell icon, all that stuff down below. But yeah, I will see you guys next week.